for Fritz, your one-stop for news, current events, entertainment, and all things relating to the paranormal, the supernatural, the Fortean, and things that go bump in the night. Hello, Fritz here with you. Tonight we start with 3 very special stories. This first one from Nick Spry. It's the Curse of the Hope Diamond. Check it out.
We have a lot to learn from this wolf.
I want to hang out with him.
You guys actually know anything about the Hope Diamond Curse?
I know it looks sweet as around Hans's neck.
Before diamonds were discovered in Brazil in 1720 and then later on in South Africa in the mid to late 19th century, all diamonds came from India.
I didn't know that.
We've always loved shiny rocks. We will kill, we will murder for shiny rocks.
Well, but the Indians didn't quite feel that way. In Indian lore, diamonds are referred to as Vajra. That's V-A-J-R-A, or thunderbolts. And they were thought of as sort of a receptacle for powerful energies. They could only be handled and wielded by gods, and that would form the thunder and lightning in the sky. And in their culture as well, it was kind of looked down upon to cut the diamonds unless you were removing impurities, because the more weight that the diamond had, the more power that it could absorb. And they never refined them to the point of refracting light. They always thought that it was more of a gemstone to protect and absorb bad energies.
It's just a big raw diamond, like just crust taken away, just the...
Well, they were cut, but
Okay.
they were roughly cut, and they weren't cut into what we think of now as gemstones. And blue diamonds in particular were relevant to the god Yama, who was the god of death, but he would also destroy evil. Jean-Baptiste Trevernier, he in 1666, but there is a authoritarian on the Hope Diamond. His name is Richard Curran. He wrote a great book about it. He works for the Smithsonian Institute. He's probably the foremost authority on the Hope Diamond in the world. He claims that it was in 1653 that he acquired this 112 and 3/16 carat roughly cut blue diamond. And this was out of the Kolar mine in Golconda, India, which was sort of known as like the El Dorado of India. It was sort of fabled for all of the riches that were there. And once this was discovered, it was brought back to France and sold to Louis XIV, the Sun King. It was sold for around what today would be $1.8 million.
Whoa.
That's it?
That's it. But it, again, uncut,
whatever.
rough.
It was a 17.
They didn't know what they had just yet.
So, at the king's behest, it was recut by Sir Pito, the court jeweler, in 1673 down to 67 carats.
A mere,
And-
a tiny speck of a jewel.
It was dubbed the French blue, which is commonly known as, but also in proper French, the blue diamond of the crown. But it doubled its value because in this era, people were learning to cut glass and to cut gemstones in order to make the most out of refracting light. It's funny because the Hope Diamond is so rare, it has a little bit of boron, 1 molecule of boron to every million molecules of carbon that gives it a deep blue color.
How do we figure this out? That's pretty impressive that we can figure out the number of molecules per square inch of a gemstone.
Through spectrographs and things like that. And,
I mean, I know how.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that when you really...
I'm aware
know how the
of
technology
how,
is involved.
sir.
I'm just saying when you really step back, it's pretty freaking fascinating, jackass. Please continue.
After the sale, though, Trevernier was allegedly mauled to death by feral dogs in Moscow
Of course
in the
he
late
was.
17th
Of course.
century. Yes, he was.
Dogs, quote
Always.
unquote. Yes.
And that is the first death attributed to the Hope Diamond Curse.
At first.
So Louis XIV, he was beleaguered by many health ailments after he had procured this diamond, especially after he had procured this diamond. He eventually dies in 1715 at the age of 77 from gangrene. But it seems like this gemstone that everyone it comes in association with, even including people that have not worn it, tend to befall to some sort of nefarious end.
Okay, so we've brought this gemstone into a house that kills people.
That's
a gemstone
what I'm
that kills
saying,
people.
man, Daddy. I'm
this is
freaking out at that.
This is
Not good,
awesome.
man.
So
It's
even
not good.
someone that just barely wore it once on borrowing it, a friend of the king, Nicolas Fouquet, he wears the diamond once, and then shortly thereafter, he is accused of embezzlement, and he is publicly disgraced and then executed. So Louis XIV's successor, Louis XV, is
Didn't see that coming.
yeah, you never expect
Yeah,
it.
they got super weird.
What a twist.
During his reign, he is awarded a title in the Order of the Golden Fleece and has the jewel set into his ceremonial ribbon piece, which is basically one of the most valuable jewelry settings that has ever been conceived. think hundreds of diamonds, and at the centerpiece of it, on the lower half, it's only a 6-inch ribbon, but hundreds of diamonds, and at the bottom half, this rare blue diamond.
And the Kanye of the time bought it immediately.
This was in 1749. And so then years later, during the French Revolution, this had been, the jewel had been basically become part of the French crown jewels at this time. So during the French Revolution, in the fall of 1792, the royal family is imprisoned during the reign of terror, quote unquote. And meanwhile, the French crown jewels, they are under lock and key in the royal storehouse. And during one of the most notorious robberies of all time. So basically, a group of thieves over 5 nights broke in and out of the royal storehouse, stealing every possession of the royal family.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not just talking about jewels. I'm talking about sconces, paintings, clothing, they took everything. It was basically
They took the sconces?
They took the sconces.
These people.
That's what I'm talking about.
These people need their sconces, for God's sakes.
But there's even a theory, also according to Richard Curran, that perhaps the French Revolution was staged in order to commit the robbery of this particular gem. And also, during this time, you have to think about the hit list. Hit list!
Da-da-da-da-da!
Louis XVI, King of France, in 1792, went to the guillotine. His wife, Marie Antoinette, went to the guillotine. Princess Marie-Louise de Landau, she was beaten, raped, and literally ripped to pieces by an angry mob. Wow. And she had been known to wear out the Hope Diamond on many occasions. So after this theft, the diamond disappears. And it's around this time there are some rumors that Catherine the Great briefly possessed the diamond before she died of apoplexy in 1796.
Oh.
Then, in 1812, a 44-carat diamond emerges in London in possession of Daniel Eliasson. And this was bought by George IV, King of England. And it was set into a big sort of you resemblance of the Order of the Fleece ribbon to Napoleon, who he had been battling.
So it's 44 carats?
Yes, it went down from 67 carats to 44, 45 carats when Louis XV had it set into an Order of the Fleece emblem.
What'd they do with the extra
yeah,
carats?
Somebody
where'd the
whacked off
carats
a big
go?
piece of it. And
Yeah.
sold it
There's
to
actually
someone else.
many theories about this, and they have at the Smithsonian pieced it back together that there is 3 separate stones that have come off of the original.
The Infinity Stones.
Well, could be. Nobody knows. Let's not get that deep in the conjecture. There was one that was owned by Charles of Brunswick, who was a German duke, who had probably the most fantastic diamond collection in the world in the 18th, 19th century. So there is that one, there is the Hope Diamond, and then there is a much smaller piece that they have all confirmed have come from the original George IV, who possessed the stone. There's actually a very notable portrait of him in 1822 wearing it on his breast. He dies in financial ruin in 1830, and the executor of his state, the Duke of Wellington, ends off selling the stone on the sly to his good friend that also was friends with George IV, Thomas Hope, a family of great wealth. They actually fronted the money for the Louisiana purchase to America when it was bought.
Nice.
Oh.
Yes, so a very, very wealthy family of Anglo-Dutch descent. This was done without public knowledge to avoid humiliating the royal lineage. George, he died because he was a terrible alcoholic. He suffered from dropsy, and upon his death, doctors discovered that he had an orange-sized tumor in his bladder, amongst other ailments. So Thomas Hope's brother, Henry Philip, he was a diamond collector and aficionado, and so the stone was passed then on to him, and during the next 3 generations of Hopes, the stone eventually gains its name by showing it at World's Fairs, at the London Exposition, in the Crystal Palace.
Spreading that evil everywhere.
Yes, and then it became known as the Hope Diamond.
Like, hope you don't die.
Yes, but again, the hit list on this one,
Da-da-da-da-da!
so we have, in between the succession of George IV to its next owners, Wilhelm Falls, who supposedly recut the diamond to disguise it. It's stolen by his son, who also murdered him. Then his son, Hendrik Falls, commits suicide. And then Francis Beaulieu, he steals the stone and then dies in abject poverty and misery after that. So, Henry Philip Hope, he has many misfortunes, including the death of his son, and he dies without an heir. Henry's daughter, Henrietta, married into the aristocracy, marrying the Earl of Lincoln. And this then brought onto the stone a family heirloom aspect, where it could not be separated from the family name without the court of law. So, Henrietta's youngest son, Francis, ends up marrying May Yohei, who is an American stage actress from Pennsylvania in the late 19th century. More tragedy strikes in the fact that Francis gambles away the family fortune. Again, he is an earl, he is an aristocrat, and it is estimated that he, in today's monetary value, gambled away between $450 and $600 million.
Damn!
Yes.
But he had a good time. There's no way he did not have the best time anyone could ever imagine.
What a waste.
I know, but still, damn.
And he eventually dies alone in poverty.
Of course, but with a smile on his face, probably.
May ends up running off with Putnam Strong, who is the son of former New York City Mayor William Strong, and despite her fame, also dies penniless. But before their deaths, the stone was approved for sale in order to save the family legacy in 1901. The diamond was sold to Joseph Frankels and Sons, a jewelers in New York City. And using most of the capital for this investment, the firm begins to go into ruin. And the story of a curse just now, after all of these hundreds of years, starts to appear in newspapers, and it's mainly purported by the New York Times and the Post.
What was the first news sighting, or new report?
I know the word hoodoo was used.
Hoodoo.
Who do the voodoo that you do?
In between this period, while they owned it, it was shown and sold to Abdul Hamid in 1908 via his second, Salim Habib. So Habib ends up drowning in the sinking of the French steamer Seine of Singapore in November 1909, and the Sultan is eventually overthrown in the Young Turks Revolution. The stone was also sold before his overthrow to pay off his debts in Paris in 1909 for about $80,000, which is now around $2.17 million. It was sold to Pierre Cartier of jeweler's fame. And in 1910, he started to try to sell this stone, this very famous stone, and employed an old story in order to do so. He was trying to sell it to Ned and Evelyn McLean. McLean owned the Washington Post at the time. He was a paper magnate. The story he employed was one of Wilkie Collins, who wrote a story called The Moonstone. And this is back in the late 19th century. He was friends with Charles Dickens, but it recounts the story of a priestess trying to steal the yellow gem out of the statue of a Hindi god, and was forever cursed and trapped. And then once the stone was recovered, everything went back to normal. But this same story was inspired by none other than Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the original procurer of the Hope Diamond, who mentioned in one of his journeys this folktale, recounting the same sort of details. And this is where the curse was built off of. The couple, knowing this, still bought the stone. Evelyn was convinced that things that were bad luck for other people were good luck for her. And then yet, tragedy strikes her family.
Shocker!
Yeah. In 1919, her son Vincent, while they were attending the Kentucky Derby, was struck by a Model T Ford going about 8 miles an hour down the road. He was a very young child.
Went to a racehorse, got hit by a car.
He was concussed and died from complications of the injury. Her daughter, at the age of 25, committed suicide from a drug overdose. Her husband, Ned, was implicated in the Teapot Dome scandal of Warren G. Harding's presidency. He was the guy that signed the checks. Lost everything, went insane, and spent the last of his days in a insane asylum in Towson, Maryland, which coincidentally is where I was born.
Oh, wow. So you got just a little bit of curse on you?
Just a little bit of curse.
A little bit of curse on you.
Evelyn was very generous with the stone and generous to society, and so nothing really bad besides the other tragedies befell her personally. I'm saying
nothing bad other than the other tragedies.
The deaths in her family.
Nothing befell her personally. She was not injured or...
all around her died in misery.
But upon her death, the entire lot of her gem collection was bought by Harry Winston Incorporated. He was a jeweler, and he eventually donated it to the Smithsonian Institute in 1958. And oddly enough, he shipped it through registered mail.
Really?
Yes, he did.
Just to spread the curse throughout the Americas.
Yep. $2.65 postage with insurance.
What was the insurance like on that? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
He put it in a brown paper bag wrapped box, and yet even the man that picked up the delivery, he delivered it in November. In February, his wife died. His dog died. He was struck by a car and broke both his legs, and eventually died from complications.
Oh my God.
So all the way up until the last guy, I was just gonna say this seems like the standard like foibles of rich assholes, right? Like bought this amazing $3 million diamond and then wrecked in a ship, like a steamer off the coast of whatever. and the Sultan was like, defamed.
Mauled by his prize
Right,
camel.
exactly.
Right.
But the mailman thing definitely is weird for sure. That's strange.
You are listening to Fort Fritz on Real Radio 104.1.
Fort Fritz on Real Radio 104.1.
Welcome back to Fort Fritz. Hello, Fritz here. This is a very cool story. An unexplainable death of a handsome, gorgeous man. This is Tamam Shud and the Somerset Man on Fort Fritz.
Have you guys ever heard of the Tamam Shud case?
Bless you.
Tamam Shud. This is possibly one of the coolest things that I have read about, and it's unfortunate. It's it's about a dead man.
Did you say Mystery of Summerland, man?
Somerton, Somerton.
Somerton, man.
Somerton man, because he was found on December 1st, 1948, on Somerton Beach in Glenlegg, just south of Adelaide, South Australia.
Oh, mate.
Tamam Shud, the reference to that comes from the Persian phrase, which was printed on a scrap of paper found months later in the pocket of the man's trousers. The scrap had been torn from the final page of a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, authored by 12th century poet Omar Khayyam. Following the public appeal, someone actually came out and was able to locate a copy of this relatively rare book that had a piece of this paper torn out of it. And on the back cover, they were able to start doing some sleuthing and found some indentations, and it led down this sort of rabbit hole. It's one of the most mysterious, I guess, cold cases in Australia's history, and kind of goes in several different directions that you're not expecting. So, 1948, 6:30 a.m., the police were contacted about a man dead on Somerton Beach. He was found lying in the sand across from an orphanage, and a couple of people said that they saw him lying with his back resting against a seawall, his legs extended in front of him, and
Just
his
like
feet
Tammy.
crossed.
Yeah.
It was believed that he died while sleeping. An unlit cigarette was on the right collar of his coat. So if you imagine, he was just like that.
Mm-hmm.
A search of his pockets revealed an unused second-class rail ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, a bus ticket from that city that could not be proved to have been used, a narrow aluminum American comb, half a packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, an Army Club cigarette packet containing 7 different cigarettes of different brands, and a quarter full box of Bryant and May matches. They basically said they thought maybe he was a drunk man who fell asleep on the beach, but they realized that something was wrong because apparently the mosquitoes are insane on that beach, and he was getting destroyed by them, and they figured that there's no way that guy is alive. He's being swarmed.
Well, would they go after dead animals as well? Like,
I
you
don't
would
know how
think
that works.
If the blood isn't being pumped,
I guess it was freshly dead,
Yeah,
if
that's
it's still
true.
at the surface. Hell, I'm sure. But after they end up looking like grapes on him because they're just enjoying being there.
Pathologist John Burton Cleland said the man was of Britisher appearance and thought to be of age around 40 to 45.
We all know what he means by that, too. You can see it. You're like, oh, yeah, totally.
He was in top physical condition, 180 centimeters, which is about 5'11", tall, with gray eyes and fair to ginger-colored hair. Slightly gray around the temples, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and hands and nails that showed no signs of manual labor. Big and little toes that met in a wedge shape like those of a dancer or someone who wore boots with pointed toes.
Okay, now it's getting specific.
Pronounced high calf muscles like those of a ballet dancer. These can be dormant genetic traits, but they are also characteristics of many long-distance runners and various athletes.
They're impressed by this guy.
Right? I was going to say, he kind of sounds hot.
Deep blue eyes that you get lost in for hours
and
at
just
a time.
runners'
Crystalline.
calves that you could just grate cheese onto your
Soft,
salad.
supple skin that you just want to fall asleep on.
All labels on the clothes had been removed, and he had no hat, which was apparently unusual for 1948. or a
That was
wallet.
like the headline, Hatless Corpse Found.
Shock horror. The body was clean-shaven, carried no identification, which lead police to believe he had committed suicide. His teeth did not match the dental records of any living known person that they had access to, and the coroner, Cleveland, remarked that if the body had been carried to its final resting place, then all difficulties would disappear. Which, I guess from his end, the investigation, he'd be able to explain it if he could say that it was carried there, but it didn't appear that. The autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist estimated the time of death around 2 a.m. on December 1st. There was blood mixed with the food in the stomach, both the kidneys were congested, and the liver contained a great excess of blood in the vessels. The spleen was strikingly large, about 3 times the normal size, and there was a destruction in the center of the liver. Autopsy shown that his last meal was a pasty eaten 3 to 4 hours before his death, and they couldn't conclude that the pasty contained anything that would have caused this.
However, his suicide note said, "I should have eaten the fish."
Pasty too heavy for death on beach.
Hashtag too pasty, too heavy for
life. Pathologist Dwyer concluded, "I am quite convinced the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. Although poisoning was remained as prime suspicion, the pasty was not to believe to be the source of the poison. Other than that, the coroner was unable to reach a conclusion as to the man's identity or cause of death, or whether the man seen alive at Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30th was the same man that people had seen earlier. People talked about seeing a man jogging, essentially a smartly dressed man jogging on the beach."
Fashion was everything back then.
Oh, yeah.
It's like
man
number
doesn't
one,
have a hat on.
Yeah, this guy doesn't have a hat. Number 2, manhunt underway for man with 2 hats. It's like that's the next headline, the logical conclusion. A guy just runs home, sirens blaring. He like closes the front door, looks at his wife, and goes, "Burn my hats, all of them."
January, so about a month later, the staff of the Adelaide rail station discovered a brown suitcase with its label removed, which had been checked into the station cloakroom the morning before the man was found.
So someone's also removing labels from clothing.
It's interesting.
Really into it, too.
In the case were a red checked dressing gown, a size 7 red felt pair of slippers, 4 pairs of underpants, pajamas, shaving items, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, an electrician's screwdriver, a table knife cut down into a sharp instrument, a pair of scissors with sharpened points, a stenciling brush used by third officers on merchant ships for stenciling cargo. Also in the suitcase was a thread card of Barber brand orange wax thread of an unusual type not found in Australia. It was the same type that was used to repair the lining of the pockets in the trousers that the dead man was wearing. So that's how they were able to identify that this stuff was his stuff. All the identification marks on the clothes had been removed. The police found the name T. Keene on a tie, Keene on a laundry bag, and Keene without the last E on a signet, along with 3 dry cleaning marks. Police believe that whoever removed the clothing tags specifically left the Keene tags on the clothing, knowing that the Keene was not the dead man's name. With wartime rationing still enforced, clothing was difficult to acquire at the time, and although it was common practice to put name tags on your stuff, it was also common when buying secondhand clothing to remove the tags. There was no T. Keene missing in any English-speaking country, and a nationwide circulation of the dry cleaning marks also proved to be fruitless. Police checked train records. They speculated that the man got to the port of Augusta, showered and shaved around 10:50 a.m. Then he purchased a ticket to Henley Beach for whatever reason he didn't use. He immediately checked the suitcase in at the station cloakroom before leaving the station and catching a city bus to Glenlegg. Upon a re-examination, John Burton Cleland noted that the man's shoes were remarkably clean and appeared to have been polished, rather than being in a state expected of a man who had been wandering the beach of Glenlegg all day.
They are impressed by this dude, man.
He added that evidence.
He had high calves.
He was a perfect Adonis, only dead.
So sharp dressed. He added evidence that fitted in with the theory that the body might have been brought to Somerton Beach after the man's death, accounting for the lack of evidence of vomiting and convulsions, which would be the 2 main effects of the poison theory. That there's no evidence of him seizing and passing out or whatever from a poison.
Well, also they found beach sand, right, in one of his suitcases.
They found sand in the cuffs.
Sand,
of
so
one
it could
of
have
the
been. They probably didn't have DNA testing to find out what sand it was.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what the sand detection was like in 1948. Cedric Stanton Hicks, a professor of physiology and pharmacology at the University of Adelaide, tested that a group of drug variants that he called number 1, and in particular number 2, were extremely toxic and relatively small oral doses, and that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to identify it if it had been given to a suspect. The names were not released to the public, as at the time they were, quote, quite easily procurable by the ordinary individual from a chemist without the need for a reason. The drugs were later publicly identified as Digitalis and Ouabain.
Ouabain.
Ouabain. Ouabain. So basically, they couldn't, from investigating the body or the stuff that they found, conclude who the this guy was, or what killed him, or how he ended up in this like perfectly polished position, very clean, sitting in this rock outcropping. So around the same time as they were doing the reinvestigation, they found the printed piece of paper with Tamam Shud printed on it. Public library officials were called in to identify it. They say that it means ended or finished.
Well, seems
Found
right.
on the last page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The other side of the paper was blank. Police conducted an Australia-wide search to find a copy of the book that had a similar piece torn out. A photograph of the scrap of paper was released to the press. A man named who ended up going by the pseudonym Ronald Francis, who didn't want to be identified, basically came out and said that he knew where the book was, or he had this book that they removed the piece of paper from, basically. And it was like, oh, well, how do we know? So they were able to actually do like microscopic check and make sure that like the tear is matched up, and it was like from the same fiber of the paper or whatever. So it was true.
Was it always missing, or did he open up one day and said, "Hey, where's my Tamam Shud?"
I don't know. I don't know that he still had the book.
Well, that's what I meant. But I mean, by the scrap was it? Did he buy the book? He was like, "Damn, this book has no Tamam Shud."
I don't know.
One day, he's like, "My Tamam Shud's gone."
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't think it was like the last piece. It was just like a word in this book. It was ripped out.
Okay.
The man reached out, said he found the book that matches the thing. The cops show up, and then on the back of the book, they find that there are like indentions from somebody writing something on the back of the book. A telephone number, an unidentified number, and a text that resembled an encrypted message. So the encryption is basically gibberish. It's
That's all. That always works.
yeah. It's just, but it is English character, I guess Latin characters, right? It is WRGOABAD. So interestingly,
Why did you pick those particular?
that's the top, because that's the top of the encryption.
That's what it says.
WRGOABABD.
I thought you were just picking out random ones to say what the alphabet is.
Yeah, those are alphabets.
Those are my favorite letters.
The second line had been struck out, which was considered significant because then it's repeated essentially on the fourth line. So they think that's how you can that's the key, is something got messed up in that second line that he struck out and then had to like rewrite it.
Nice.
So they've had several code breakers. Code experts were called in to decipher. Everything's been unsuccessful. An unlisted telephone number was also in the back of the book, belonging to a nurse named Jessica Ellen Joe Thomas, who was born in 1921, died in 2007. Born Jessie Harkness in the Sydney suburb of Merrickville.
So this all relates to actual people?
Yes. She lived in Moseley, Glenegg, about 400 meters north of where the body was found. So they find this book. They find a telephone number on the back of the book. Telephone number refers to a woman who lives 1,300 feet north of where the body was found. When she was interviewed by police, Thompson said she did not know the dead man. She said she didn't know why the dead man would have her phone number and chose to visit her on the suburb on the night of his death. However, she also reported that sometime in late 1948, an unidentified man had attempted to visit her and asked a next-door neighbor about her. In his book about the case, Gary Feltus says that he interviewed Thompson. He found that she was either being evasive or that she just didn't want to talk about it.
Oh.
Feltus believed Thompson knew Somerton man's identity. Thompson's daughter, Kate, in a television interview on 60 Minutes, also said that she believed her mother knew the dead man. In 1949, Jessica Thomas requested the police not keep a permanent record of her name or release details to third parties, as it would be embarrassing and harmful to her reputation to be linked. The police agreed, a decision that hampered later investigations. They made a plaster cast of his face because
He was just so damn
He was
hot.
so handsome.
It was so hot. We had to keep this for posterity.
When she was shown the plaster bust of the dead man by Detective Sergeant Lean Thompson, she said she could not identify the person depicted. According to Lean, he described her reaction upon seeing the cast as completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint.
Whoa.
In an interview many years later, Paul Lawson, the technician who made the cast and was present when Thompson viewed it, noted after looking at the bust, she immediately looked away and would not look back.
Really? So it looked just like him?
There's no way she
Well,
didn't know.
she goes in and she's like, I don't know who this is. And then they show her like, oh, you don't know who this is? And she
shocked.
Looks away and just like won't look back. Thompson said that while she was working in the Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney during World War II, she owned a copy of the Rubaiyat, that book.
Oh.
In 1945, at the Clifton Gardens Hotel, she had given it to an Army lieutenant named Alf Boxall, who was serving at the time in the water transport section of the Royal Australian Engineers. Thompson told police that after the war ended, she moved to Melbourne and married, and she said that she had received a letter from Boxall, and she replied telling him that she was now married and not interested. There's no evidence that Boxall had any contact with Harkness after 1945. So they're saying that maybe she made this up, the story of her
Gotcha.
dealing with this guy. So they find this guy, Alf Boxall. He's working at a bus depot somewhere else in Australia. And he had a copy of the book that she had signed and like written out a verse of. This is the verse that she highlighted. Indeed, indeed, repentance oft before. I swore, but I was sober when I swore. And then came spring, and rose in hand, my threadbare penitence a pieces tore. So there's this weird
piece.
There's weird
Sober, right?
symbolism and stuff going on. There is speculation that Alf Boxall was a spy for the Australian intelligence, or the British intelligence, during World War II. They, in fact, asked him during an interview, Mr. Boxall, you had been working, hadn't you, in an intelligence unit before you met this young woman, Jessica Harkness. Did you talk to her at all about that? And Boxall says no. And when asked if Harkness could have known something about it, he replies, not unless somebody told her. So he agrees that he was in it, but that he hadn't told anyone about this. When Littlemore suggested the interview that there could have been espionage connected to the Somerton man, Boxall replies, that's quite a melodramatic thesis, isn't it? This is a bus depot mechanic guy who is now just for some reason hanging out in this weird city in Australia. His copy of the book that had the page torn out, it wasn't the same one that had the page torn out, but it was his copy of this same book that this dead man has a scrap of in his pocket that they find 1,300 feet from this woman who says she doesn't know anything about any of it.
So it's this microcosm of strange.
Right.
It's a love triangle that the won't admit to. No offense to you know, I mean, it all just seems to point towards that, kind of.
Yeah, kind of, but I mean,
but like, how would any of these normal people have killed any of them with this like untraceable poison?
It was easy to find, and the one guy was deep military.
He did know, yeah, that's true.
You know, that's where they probably teach you how to do that. You're very welcome. Case solved.
So even years after they buried the man, flowers began appearing on the grave. They questioned a woman who was seen leaving the cemetery. She claimed to know nothing about him. One of the railway workers came out with a story where they had seen a strange man visiting the Somerton man in his train car, and he was English-speaking and only carrying a small black case, not unlike one a musician or a doctor might carry.
Interesting.
This story was covered several times. In fact, recently on like 60 Minutes, and they had like a little mini documentary on it, and it's all extremely interesting, and it's difficult to go into like all the different nuance of who these people were and what connection they end up having to the Somerton man. But suffice it to say that you should look it up, because again, it was going to be difficult to jam it into this amount of time. But dead guy, scrap of paper in his pocket that says ended, 1,300 feet from a woman's house, who has her telephone number written on the back of a book that piece of paper was removed from. So yeah, and then we've got some random, bus mechanic somewhere who has the similar copy of the book and has very, clinical Australian salty answers for, what was going on during that time. Attempts to use modern DNA to identify him have kind of failed because they used formaldehyde to embalm him, so it's kind of screwed a lot of stuff up. But they were able to salvage hair follicles from the plaster bust that they had created that had been like pulled out of his skin.
Yeah, his death mask.
Right. So,
hot death mask.
So hot.
They hope that at some point, if they're able to, cross-reference the DNA with someone, they can find out who it is. There's different reports as to who it might be. Several people have come forward and said it's my dad or my son or whatever.
But it's going to be a long-ranging Australian mystery.
Yeah, it's definitely something that is extremely winding and strange.
So, what's your story? I mean, does any of that?
You are listening to Fort Fritz on Real Radio 104.1.
Fort Fritz on Real Radio 104.1.
Welcome back to Fort Fritz. Hello, Fritz here. If you would ever like to get a hold of us or learn more about us, why don't you follow us on Facebook? That's just at Fort Fritz. We will we'll thank you later for it. This next story from yours truly. Let's get into it. The Bewitched George Lukens. If you would like more information, just download that iHeartRadio app and search Fort Fritz or Fort Fritz Campfire Tales to hear these individual stories.
Have you guys ever heard of George Lukens?
Not George Lucas.
George Lucas.
No.
Lukens?
Wait, did I
Rock,
research
Texas.
the wrong guy?
No, he's supposed to be talking about the guy that created Star Wars.
Yeah, he was haunted by the ghost of...
The Ewoks.
Yeah, hold up.
They're making all that noise.
Let me pull up
And we
Wikipedia.
always remember the Ewoks were going to eat them.
Yeah, they
The
were.
Ewoks were going to freaking eat them.
Spoilers, dude! I told you that I've only been through 1.5 Star Wars movies, and no, I'm sorry, 2.2, I guess.
2 really good ones of the 9.
The one where he gets frozen in the
Carbonite.
tinfoil, and then
Carbonite.
and
Planet
then,
Hoth.
Tinfoil.
the one where he pops off on the floating spaceship, and where Princess Leia chokes out the slug.
All spaceships float.
The Dune spaceship when they're in Dune World.
Okay, first, that's a totally different story. The Dune is a totally different story. You're talking about the Sarlacc pit.
Okay, can I tell my story?
Does it involve spice?
No. George Lukens was a commoner in England who had a pretty strange trip. The story dates back to the 18th century. On a Saturday in May 1778, the Honorable Anglican Vicar of Temple Church, Reverend Joseph Easterbrook, had his first encounter with George Lukens after a traveler named Sarah Barber told him something was super
Oh,
and
okay.
so this is how these two met.
Okay,
All right.
Vickers probably hears some super from time to time. Right?
Probably.
Like, you're the vicar.
The vicar's like, well, God loves all of his children, but how are we talking? Purely for the sake of comedic transparency, we will now refer to the vicar as Joey.
Joey the Vicar.
Okay.
George Lukens is now going to be Georgie Boy.
Georgie
All
boy.
And Sarah Barber will be thusly referred to as the footnote in history only afforded to the types of women who truly call for challenging about-faced and metaphysical challenges of religion, ideology, ultimately bringing into the new world a vastly different point of view. Traveling lady. So
Damn, you
traveling
got
lady
deep on that one.
Yeah.
introduces Joey.
Is it Sarah with an H?
Yeah. With Georgie Boy.
Sarah.
Traveling lady approaches Joey and says he should really check on old Georgie Boy. Quote, he's in a bad way, barking like a dog, as it were, unquote. I made that up. I don't know if that's quoted.
Probably how it went down.
As it were, sounds like the way they would put that.
Yeah,
So,
I believe it.
he's a common carrier. By the way, do you know what a common carrier is?
Do not.
Like when it comes to a disease? Or
Oh, yeah, that would be, what's it called? Infection by vector, like a mosquito.
Right.
Is it an airline ticket you get?
A common carrier ticket on an airline. Yeah. I thought all of those things too, but
Sure.
literally it's a blue-collared worker back then. So like
common
a smithy, whatever, common carrier.
Like a dude you could yell at if you were a nobleman.
Literally, yeah, Kaz just nailed it. Common.
If you just had a bad day, you could just take
Get
it out
over
on
here.
them. Yeah.
Give me some meat or whatever.
So it's
we
a
drink out
retail
here.
worker.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can just take out all your frustrations.
Hold your
are there-
jeans.
Are there people that just do that?
Yeah.
There's people that just like, man, I'm just going to go to a retail store and just rip on someone's
I need
ass.
to
That's
speak
it.
to someone's manager. That's like the whatever.
You get the
1800.
haircut and you go.
Yep. Can I speak to your boss haircut? So, traveling lady say black magic cursed Georgie Boy, quote, in which he sang and screamed in various sounds, some of which did not resemble a human voice, and declared doctors could do him no service, unquote. That is an actual quote.
Oh.
But traveling lady say Georgie Boy for nearly 2 decades had been acting off his rocker, a rocker having been invented the Wednesday previous. Joey,
You had fun writing this, didn't you?
Technology is still unproven. A little wobbly. Might have thrown him.
Nice. Trendy.
now stick with me here. Joey said the lady say Georgie Boy has been acting crazier and crazier ever since God smacked his silly ass during a Christmas pageant. And that's an actual
What?
That's an actual quote.
Smacks his
Silly ass? Was silly ass in the quote?
No, but that's an actual thing that happens in this story. He said he was doing a pageant. I can only imagine. You're a grand old flag. And then he just felt a and said,
Oh man.
God smacked him.
Theater
during-
people are really, really critical.
Yeah, exactly.
caught like a funky look from the crowd, and he was just like, "I'm Dan."
He gets up.
God has smoked
Grand
me.
old flag.
He gets the hook and just gets pulled off stage.
So guess what happens? They lock Georgie Boy up. 20 weeks go by. He's pronounced incurable by a surgeon for whatever the reason. No records indicate the surgeon, a Dr. Smith, did any operating. But since this was the 18th century, who cares? The medical community said he was bewitched. Worth noting, first written evidence of the word schizophrenia is still over 100 years off.
Oh, damn.
Which is most likely the explainable demon in all of this, but exacerbating the sitch. Georgie Boy says 7 demons inside him. would gladly up at least 7 clergymen.
Oh.
Joey gets the help of Reverend John Volton, asking if the good Reverend would, quote, agree to pray for Georgie boy, unquote. And again, I made that one up. Volton, quote, cried out before God, Lord, I am not fit for such a work, unquote. That's real. Volton later, he cucked out and made a Reverend John Wesley pray for Georgie boy instead. This guy had one job. They said, can you pray for one dude? And he said, oh, I don't know if I can.
Barking like a dog.
I don't know if I
bewitched.
can.
Wow.
So he had a Reverend John Wesley pray for Georgie boy. The good Reverend John Wesley will henceforth be known as Johnny. The exorcism recounted in the Bristol Gazette said Georgie boy claimed he was the devil and did a lot of other things that could totally never be source cited. Like somehow, someone in the presence of the event duly noted Georgie boy, inverted an entire verse from a 4th century hymnal, and sang it.
Like backwards.
Backwards.
Oh.
Like, now, phonically backwards or just word for word backwards?
Again.
And also, you got to be well versed in that this thing that he was claiming to know, that this man spit backwards, because I don't know that even my favorite songs, if they were repeated backwards to me, that I would be able to pick them out.
Yeah.
No, because you have a trivia bit about just saying lyrics and they don't make sense.
Yeah, if you take a lyric that you've heard before and if you say it in a different pattern and rhythm, it'll just completely lose it.
Just insane stuff. And also would do normal stuff, like just act violently, that these people were trying to...
Like acting violent.
Trying to take 7 souls out of this corpse. You know, just corpse waiting to happen, pretty much.
Pre-corpse.
So, Johnny and Joey, nicely done. Johnny and Joey, again, they are the reverends, casted the 7 demons out of Georgie boy alone. Well, the 2 of them, because this is what I wrote.
Oh, God.
You're amusing the hell out of yourself, and I love it.
Apparently by reciting basic religious stuff.
Nice. Perfect.
Do other priests front up at other priests when they're like, I got the deep, I mean...
I don't know.
Do you just drop a Bible and walk out?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Johnny had something to say after the ceremonial debriding of the spirit. He said the account would be indebted to the modern era of skepticism, but then pointed to the scriptures and, quote, other authentic history, unquote, to further back what he, Johnny, would say was completely objectively and not subjectively, mind you, classic evidence of a demonic possession. At the time, a noted demonologist, a Dr. Ferriar,
I want to be a demonologist.
criticized the
Sounds
case. Yeah,
so
right?
Yeah.
Criticized the case. He didn't feel as though Georgie boy really suffered from a demonical episode, but rather maybe epilepsy or mental illness were to blame. Again, schizophrenia is 100 years off from even being diagnosed. Dr. Ferriar goes so far as to call him an imposter masquerading as a demoniac.
Demoniac.
Ooh, demoniac.
We opened for those guys in Tampa. They're really cool.
Yes.
You love every band you play
I was
with.
going to say he's never played with a band he doesn't like.
Are you kidding? I could tell you plenty of bands I play with I don't like.
Pro.
I played with the Balloon Boys band, okay?
Is that real?
Yes. Yes, the kid that was in the balloon that everybody watched on the network news. They thought he was in the balloon. He was just hiding up in the attic. Yeah, he had a band, and they opened for us, and they sucked.
And they were called the Balloon Boy
No, I can't remember their names.
Oh, God.
Just
really on
that
the
last
nose.
check.
Yeah,
Really leaning on that.
and we didn't even know they were opening for us until we got to the gig. We go to the gig. I'm looking at the flyer. I'm looking at the flyer. I'm like,
Are you the
that
Balloon Boy?
freaking Balloon Boy, dude?
How would you know
How
my
did you recognize
face?
him?
Because
Yeah.
they played at a local club here a month previous that I just happened to be
What
at.
was that from?
I want to make a Fall from Grace reference, but in open it up for Gargamel.
The lowest of the low.
Man.
There's nowhere to go from there.
Where do they live? Where was Bubble Boy?
Balloon Boy.
Balloon Boy.
Somewhere,
Boy.
somewhere Midwest or something,
I
probably.
keep thinking Bubble Boy.
I think Bubble Boy,
yeah,
too.
Balloon
That's
Boy.
just
Where,
Jake
where
Bubble
were
Boy
they?
is a sad story of a man with an immune disorder. Yeah.
John Travolta did a movie about
Yeah,
it.
Yes, he
I
did.
thought it was Jake Gyllenhaal.
He did it too.
And here we are.
And that was your Bubble Minute.
And here we are. Georgie boy never ever did anything stupid forever after, okay? And the world is still skeptical of actual fact-based news to this day. So thank you so much, traveling lady, for everything.
So just from her account of what we've learned about 7 demons being, was that like one of the first
I don't know. I think it's so funny how this person, Sarah Barber, said, "Hey, I don't know, check on this guy," and then he was just tortured. It's like it goes into those religious stories of, well, I don't know, but she's a bitch, let's kill her.
Yeah.
And always go and blame the woman.
Yeah.
Clearly perform some black magic on him. No, I think the real funny part to me on this is the fact that the medical community, quote unquote, diagnosed him. So somewhere on a piece of paper was written "Bewitched."
Yeah, and
Yeah,
also
that's true.
a surgeon.
That's tight as exactly
surgeon.
like a surgeon was
Yeah.
like.
whose job is to go into the skin and look at
Probably
things
just
and
a
like,
barber.
I can't fix them.
You know
I
what?
don't know what it was.
Demons.
Demons. Gotta be demons. I think you should do some cocaine about it.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. Up next, Bungalower and the Bus. Good night. Be safe. Stay spooky.
Until next time, pleasant dreams.